Yeah, we're good. Recording has started. Yeah, okay.
Good morning, folks, and good evening to Kirsten. It's 11 p.m. Where Kirsten is, so we're very grateful for her to make the commitment of time. Kirsten is a colleague and a friend of my own from the University of Waikato in New Zealand, and she's in the School of Education. Currently, I think, head of academic integrity. Is that correct, Kirsten?
Yes.
Yeah. She was Associate Dean of Academic, I think, if I remember correctly, and now Head of Academic Integrity. So I'll be coming back to you definitely on that piece. Kirsten would be known, I would suggest, internationally because of her work in both PE and curriculum and pedagogy, and then also the wider relationship of teacher education and professional development. So I'd be very familiar with Kirsten's work, and I value the actual word integrity that she does her work with. I also noticed, Kirsten, that you've moved into the sort of middle leadership space. So I might be coming back to you on that in relation to a bit of work I'm thinking of for myself on that. You're very welcome, Kirsten. The group that you have are in that sort of PE curriculum pedagogy space. And I suspect that there'll be that interest in relation to what you have to share with us this morning or this evening where you are. So I hand over the floor to you, Kirsten. Thank you.
Okay, let me share my screen. I think this should work for you. Can you see a slide now?
It's coming through.
Perfect.
Excellent.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thanks, Zane. So, tēnā koutou katoa, ka nui mai tō tātou mai, kia whakarongo, kia aro, tēnā koutou katoa. So welcome. Thanks very much for having me here today to speak with you all and present, and particularly thanks to Anne and Will for the invitation. I think we first discussed this about 12 months ago when I was actually in Limerick, which would be much more appealing than sitting here on the other side of the world right now. Yeah, I do. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to speak with you. Probably what I speak about might have changed since that discussion, and also since a range of things that have happened in New Zealand education system in the last couple of weeks. I also do want to just note that many of you last week would have seen Anne's inaugural lecture, and as per normal, she sets the bar way too high for most of us. Can assure you that at this stage of the night, I won't come close to being anywhere near as professional and or probably as funny as she typically is when she presents, but I will do my very best. What will become apparent as I present is that the landscape of health and physical education here in New Zealand and education more broadly, probably in the last 4 weeks, has undergone what I would say would be the biggest wind back of the clock in my lifetime in the education setting, both in my time in teaching and teacher education. So I thank you in advance for potentially acting as my grief counselling group as I grapple with some of the grand challenges of teaching and teacher ed in relation to physical education. I will talk health PE, wellbeing, or SPHE as you talk about it. I will slip into the HPE conversation because here that's all it's been for me since I started teaching as a shared learning area with somewhat separate subjects but connected closely. As you'll see as I present, that's changed. So I really want to frame this around some of the thinking around what we're doing in our initial teacher education program here, what it's looked like, why it's looked like it has, the decisions we've made around that, our curriculum shifts, your curriculum shifts, and what that's meant for how I might now think about initial teacher education here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, but also what it might mean for yourselves. And I will also frame that around what we would call primary teacher ed, but for you, sits probably more with the primary and junior cycle phases. So I want to start by talking about what we've been doing here at Waikato in initial teacher ed for the last probably 10 plus years, and how we have been trying to address the needs of our students alongside supporting them to be best placed to meet the needs of the learners that they encounter across primary and secondary school settings. I think it's important to note that in both our undergrad and postgrad programs, our students arguably get very limited time to focus on the specifics of teaching and learning in health and physical education as a subject. Our primary teacher ed students who graduate as generalists get approximately 36 hours of contact time within a 15-point paper on their 3-year degree. While all our secondary students are involved in a postgrad program that's a 1-year course where they get a maximum of 80 hours of dedicated health and PE curriculum time. So like people all around the world, we've argued for more time, and we will always argue for more time. But I think we've also come to settle and feel quite comfortable with having more time makes no difference if what we do isn't the right things. So more time doesn't actually help us if we're not thinking about and carefully considering what we deliver and why we deliver it. And that's where I want to share with you what we currently share with them as they come into our programs. So I know this feels a bit busy as a slide, but I'm going to just let you read for a second and then I'll speak to it. So over the last few years, we've consciously made decisions about prioritising some big ideas, and particularly a social justice theme, and really unpacking the nature and purpose of health and physical education. In the social justice aspect, we have drawn heavily on notions of intersectionality to help them start to grapple with some of the diverse needs of our learners, but equally also really challenge them to explore what the isms are and what that means, partly because we want them to be better positioned to understand the experiences of health and physical education for people unlike themselves, and for the diverse group of learners that they will see in any of their classrooms. Sitting alongside that, we really want them to have a deep understanding of what we mean by inclusion and how it's defined in different ways in different places by different people, how we think about diversity, an ongoing commitment to cultural and relational competencies. We have taken a lean into disability more recently and more heavily, and that's particularly our primary paper, because that's part of what gets slid across to us from as part of the whole program. What you'll notice as we move further up here around our planning considerations is we want them to think every time they plan about what inclusive education looks like. We've pushed them more towards universal design for learning and a notion of planning learning for all. And then we go into thinking about some models, and in primary we really are focusing, partly because of our limited time, but because we think it's a priority around effective questioning and teaching styles. Some people would say we need to spend more time on models-based stuff, and I note your senior cycle, and that's where you've kind of gone. But for the primary teacher, that we don't have time to do that, and we're not convinced that it makes a huge impact on what they actually do in their physical education time or health education time. What you will notice here, though, is that, well, let me rewind a bit. Since the curriculum, a 99 curriculum came out in 2007, we've had a very much a standards-based descriptive curriculum frame around learning outcomes, with teachers and schools having the agency to determine the context that best suits the needs of their learners and their community. So we've been really reluctant. I think about when I first came into teacher ed at Waikato, we followed much more of a teach the sport kind of multi-activity program in our own teaching. And for a while now, we've moved a long way from that, because we argued that it narrowly framed what physical education or health education could be, and we didn't believe that it helped demonstrate really equitable learning outcomes for all learners and what was relevant in their worlds and their communities. So we've continued to prioritise that big idea. At the same time, we want to challenge our students and ourselves to test these ideas and where they work. And this probably says not a lot about me as a good practitioner in any way or a critical thinker, but the biggest conundrum I've got around all of this at the moment, or one of the things we're all grappling with, is and why there's an asterisk next to the planning and learning for all, is when we're talking about that, we continue to neglect with our students how they plan for non-participants. And by that, I mean those people who are sick, who are injured, who don't have the right gear or are often excluded from a lesson for those reasons. So, I go out into schools doing placement visits and I see these young people sitting either behind me or sent off to pick up rubbish or a whole range of reasons they're not included in the lesson. And we've always talked about making our lessons really inclusive, but these people continue to be excluded. And when we do this, whether it's us or student teachers or the teachers in schools, we reinforce and reproduce kind of perceptions that there's nothing to be learned in physical education unless you're actually moving. It's kind of a practice tradition across New Zealand, and more so in intermediate and primary schools, that does little to disrupt the low status of physical education, the low status physical education is afforded in our schools. And it's the sort of questions that we want them to grapple with, our students as well, and how what they do, what they say, and how they relate to students not only impacts on the learners they're working directly with, but also how they're perceived as professionals and how our subject is positioned. So one of the challenges we're working on as a team of providers at the moment, IT providers, is how we think about planning for learning for all, which more explicitly challenges our students and our colleagues out in the field to think about what that means when we talk about the ones that are excluded, but we've always kind of accepted that as okay. Anyhow, long story short, that is where we've gone with how we think about ITE in our programs currently. And talking with colleagues across Aotearoa, there's aspects of this that mirror what they're doing as well. Some of that is purely by the constraints that sit around the time limit we have and us having to make decisions about what happens and what matters most. At the same time, we've been acutely aware of the need to ensure that what we do in initial teacher ed helps our students understand the alignment between policy and practice in the work they do. So I know many of you sitting in the room will have been involved in and know the work of Jenna and around attempting to move our students to see themselves as policy actors who take action in the sites in which they work and can use policy and policy know-how in their role as educators. And we think that's a really important commitment we need to make. So we've done this in multiple ways, but with a particular focus on advocating for more inclusive and socially just health and PE programs that move beyond what's always been done toward a place that is important for all our learners. And we have, like every country, have a raft of policy documents in New Zealand that, up until the last 4 weeks, have really underpinned that language of inclusion and an inclusive perspective. So it's been really easy to kind of push the health or PET programs to align with this, to align with quality education and the SDGs and reduced inequalities. What's also been exciting, and we're trying to think about what that means, and we've been trying to embed it in our IT program and our papers, is more and more over the last 15 years, there's been more talk of a kind of decolonising of curriculum and what that might look like, and hence the table at the bottom. And because of the country we're in and the way our communities have worked, move towards much more of an indigenisation of curriculum. And Alison Jones and her colleagues at Auckland University have really helped kind of frame some of these definitions. So when I look at these policy documents that are here, starting with the treaty, which is our founding document, they all speak the language of inclusion. More and more, our Māori Action Plan, our Pacific Action Plan, our National Education Guidelines have linked more towards a decolonising agenda. We haven't seen anything towards indigenisation yet, but in our Māori medium schools, that's completely what's happening. So we've really worked to get our students to think broadly about what it is to teach and about policy. But if you look across both those last two slides, you'll see very little about what the actual content is of health and physical education. and what skills and you need to know, as in movement skills, exercise physiology principles, or anything like that. That is because we still have a curriculum first drafted in 99 and then in 2007 that did not detail any particular sports or activities beyond aquatics. So I have to admit, I was really excited in some conversations last year when I was over, but then to see the release of your new documents in relation to the wellbeing specification, primary framework, and the subjects of physical education, I never get this right, social, personal and health education. So my own readings and discussions around these with the Mary Immaculate team last year really highlighted some parallels between some of the work we've been doing in terms of curriculum and how these first two documents of yours here line up. But I have a bit of a confession to make. I'm glad I'm actually not in the room right now, because at the same time, every time I've come to Ireland, I've been challenged to think about what constitutes the makeup of a peak program. And, I guess noting that until recently, our curriculums didn't really look that much alike. So therefore, we were continuing to kind of work in particular conditions that shaped what we said and did in the name of peak. And as I was putting this together, it made me think back to my very first visit to UL in 2007. And I remember watching Deborah and Mary work with their students on the handstand technique, and there was a massive group of them in the gym. And it was pivotal for me in two ways. One in particular was, and it's lovely that you're here, Mary, and I'm sure you can report back to DT, is watching two outstanding academics that I admired at the time see themselves and continue to see themselves as being grounded in teacher education, and teacher education being in the gym with the students and doing real stuff. And that's been pivotal in how I've thought about myself as a teacher education. At the same time, I was like, why are you doing handstands? Why are we doing this? This was then reinforced for me last year, and I happened to be in Limerick in a week that I don't know what you lot call it, but those of you who are from there will know what I'm talking about. I feel like it's the week the students go on Christmas pub rounds as opposed to coming to class. And I can't see you well enough on my screen, but I can kind of see Anne laughing. Anyhow, I was in the car with Michelle Dillon and her colleagues, and they were having a meeting online, and I just happened to, it was raining, as it does in Ireland, so I stayed in the car listening, and they were talking about the students were missing out on the sessions, and where were they ever going to learn about doing backwards and forwards rolls if they didn't actually come to class. And on both these occasions, I kind of really struggled with what's going on here and why this is happening. And, I've been in the States and seen it happen there as well, and it left me wondering always when I came away about what mattered most. And it made me really check myself in terms of where do we sit here in New Zealand around the teaching of movement skills and explicit teaching of movement skills as part of our PET program. And I think it fundamentally challenged my thinking around that, but partly because my experience as a teacher and then teacher educator, a teacher in a secondary school, teacher educator since 2003, that had never really been part of our program. And that was a reflection of a curriculum where the only explicit thing that we had to teach was aquatic education. So there's no games, no sports specified, even though we know that still happened in schools. And equally, my work with the primary school teachers over the last 20 years, and particularly our work in the Everybody Counts project, kind of convinced me, nearly convinced me, whatever, that knowing to do the skill myself or oneself is not necessary to support teachers or students to learn to move well. And if we help develop good teaching practice centered around planning for learning, centered around effective questioning, centered around inquiry-based approaches, where they can use technology and each other in ways of learning and the way they learn every day in the playground and at home and at the park and at the beach in New Zealand, then actually maybe there was other ways we could think about teaching and learning. And so making decisions where they were able to apply the right pedagogical approaches to best support the intended learning and what that would look like. So long story short, I see real parallels between what you've got in your new documents, but at the same time, I've been constantly challenged about what does that mean for how we determine what sits in our peak programs, and what will help them be well prepared to do a good job to become the policy actors that we need in schools, and who can plan and deliver physical education in ways that look fundamentally different. So as I indicated, I was kind of excited to see what the change in nature of curriculum framework and specifically the wellbeing PE, SPHE aspects mean for what IT programs look like for all of those in Ireland who are involved in the primary sector. The question, I guess, becomes what might we need to learn as teacher educators? How might we have to come to practice differently in light of the new curriculum? And I'm interested in ways we can work to help make sense of that together as a collection of people in IT primary. I've got to admit, it's also great to see the senior cycle developments with a clear models-based focus. This is completely different to how we might frame senior secondary physical education, although when I dig a bit deeper, the learning outcomes do parallel. And I see Carmen's put out a paper on models-based practice in the national curriculum. I think it only came out yesterday, or it did on my feed. So at some point I'll have a chance to read that. The thing I'm interested in hearing from you tonight, and I promised not to be here all night talking to you, is I can't kind of make sense of where the junior cycle fits. And I don't know whether it's not come out or my research skills mean I haven't found it, but I can't see how those two bits connect together and what that looks like. Equally, given the change in educational policy in New Zealand currently, I have to admit, for the first time, I feel like I want to work in Ireland more than I want to work in New Zealand, because your curriculum now has more appeal than ours. So I could just pitch this. I'd really like to come and work there, but you might not want me in your country after I've finished. So we'll see how we go. With that in mind, I see a whole lot in common when I look at it in relation to 2007 and this 2025 from your end. But yeah, that's where this story ends. Because as of the 28th of October this year, we have a draft refreshed New Zealand curriculum. It's hard for lots of us to speak about because it does literally roll us back to documents that resemble the materials that some of my colleagues had as teachers in the 1960s. It's politically framed, like all curriculum is, but at an extreme from what we've ever seen. This curriculum, on advisory group, I'm on a NDA around it. In the 2 months I was on the advisory group, we saw 3 different curriculum versions. None of them landed well with us. The last one that's been publicly released was nothing like we saw 3 weeks before that, so we have no sense of where it's come from or how it's been written, or who's written it. And there's a whole timeline of what's happened there. But across the country, every learning area has a new curriculum, all developed within the last, apart from English and Maths, all developed within the last 3 months. All of them are grounded in this notion of a knowledge-rich curriculum. However, when we're talking knowledge-rich, it's about Western facts. So concepts like co-order that have been deeply embedded, or wellbeing that have been deeply embedded in health and physical education since 1999. The minister will say, well, it's not a knowledge of the discipline, and so therefore it doesn't count. But that equally aligns with nothing Western or Pacific counts as knowledge in the worldview that's being adopted in these curriculum developments. The way it's also been presented, Gareth Stinton in a public piece, a principal wrote about it, feels like reminiscent of preparing students for Trivial Pursuit, and I'll show you some examples in a minute. It's also been very much framed in the same way that arguably the New South Wales curriculum and parts of the states have framed curriculum around the science of learning, not multiple sciences of learning, but a particular framing of a science of learning. It is more prescriptive than probably we've ever seen, let alone what we've seen since 1999, with details of what students need to know and be able to do, all framed in relation to their school year. So the year 1s will do this, the year 2s will do this, the year 3s will do this, with no sense of give either way, in the way that previous curriculum has allowed us. So for those who are interested in having a look, I've just put the QR code there, and you can either scan it now and just ignore me and look at that, or you can come back to it at a later date. But just to give you a bit of a couple of samples of the difference. And I'm conscious of time. So this is and it's really small, sorry. But what we've got here is a slice from the 2007 curriculum where we talked about level 3, and that was for years 6 to 8-ish. But as a primary school teacher, I might go, actually, none of my kids are at this, so I'm going to go back to level 2, or I'm going to go forward to level 4, or I might do a mix of level 2, 3, and 4. So we could pitch it at the needs of our level, of our students. And if you can see it or read it, you will see some aspects resemble what is in the PE and SPHE specifications in Irish curriculum. What you'll see too is that it's not overly descriptive, and in many ways we've recognised that that hasn't done a good job of always supporting teachers to be clear about what they have to do in the name of physical education and what it should look like in their classes. But as we've written and talked about, and lots of people across New Zealand and have talked about and written about in other places, it also meant that this descriptive nature meant that we didn't make progress in particular ways, but in other pockets, teachers have done an exceptional job. And so the ideas I talked about earlier in terms of the range of planning considerations, when we're seeing students and teachers embrace those things with good support from senior leaders, we've seen some really innovative practices in what physical education can look like in our primary and junior secondary. So I'm not saying in any way this was perfect, but it gave scope for individual teachers or schools to really think and rethink about the place and purpose and the nature of physical education and what it could be and how it could best meet the needs of the learners in their particular site in responsive ways, depending on the varying needs of the learners in their class. So I know, I think about that first time I came and we talked about this, and I think Lizette was with me, and I remember feeling a bit, I don't know if this is good, is it not? And I remember, I think it was you again, Mary, who was like, you can't be so hard about it, Kirsten. It's innovative and it's great. And of course, in any country, we're not ever quite happy with the way things are. Now I look at this and wish we were back there. Instead, we've moved to this. So I've just taken a slice of year 6, or just taken the year 6 slice, and only in relation to what is now called movement skills, because that's what physical education now is. And this is what physical education now looks like if you're a year 6. This is what you need to know, the facts, the concepts, the principles, and the theories that as teachers we're expected to teach. I'll just give you a second to read. So what we're now seeing is a really prescribed list of what a teacher is expected to cover with their class. And while we've had no indications of how we're expected to teach this, so the how means that a great teacher could still do this through movement. The clear message that's been given is that as a school or a teacher, you're going to have to provide evidence that all your students know these facts, these concepts, these principles and theories, but they don't necessarily need to be able to apply them in context. And for those of us sitting here reading this, we see real potential dangers in what the delivery of physical education looks like when there's already been discussions of textbooks, and you probably can see why then the Principal Gareth has noted this could be just trivial pursuit. And yeah, for those of you who are more familiar with a curriculum that specifies the content and the sports and activities that need to be covered, this probably resonates better than it does for those of us who haven't had such a prescriptive curriculum in the past. So when students know this is what they need to know. The other section is what they need to be, the practices, the skills, the strategies, and the applications to practice that need to be covered. And that's the language the ministry is referring to. This is what the ministry continues to talk about, the more doing phase of the learning areas. So there'll be some people, and we're hearing teachers talk about how much they are valuing the breakdown and the detail in which they've been provided. But equally, it lacks flexibility, and this prescriptive nature means there's potentially little room for exploring the diverse needs of learners. Equally, when we look at terms used, so across all ages, there's invasion games, there's striking and fielding games, and there's athletics from athletics only starts at year 4, but after that we have the same pattern. But even if we look at invasion games and the bracket examples there, often we're seeing in this document, the bracket examples actually play out as a list of skills that you need to be able to demonstrate to play those games. Equally, when we talk about invasion games, the concepts central to invasion games aren't necessarily evident as we might understand those game forms. And so we actually reading it as more about sport. So again, those who are familiar with it, we've talked a lot about a return to a much more multi-activity approach, which we haven't really advocated for, or actually advocated against for a long time now, as many people around the world has. So personally, I feel really uncomfortable about what this is and what it says. At the same time, I have to admit, as we've all read through this, we have found joy in highlights. The pictures at the bottom come from the 1960s handbook, but with the talk of the ministry providing detailed lesson plans, unit plans, textbooks and resources, we've kind of gone, we don't need new resources because the 1960s handbook covers basically everything we've ever talked about and done. So it's a real move away from where we've been, and it's a complete move away from where you've gone. So while I feel like you've gone, I'm going to say forward, all of you might not feel that way, but I'm going to say forward, what we see here is a real regression. And, we keep thinking about the young person who comes in who already has a range of these skills when they enter school, and particularly at year 6, and where are they challenged? We're seeing parallels with math that's already been delivered, where teachers are just teaching to the textbook. Every kid in the class is working at phase 4, even though some are at phase 2 and some are at phase 5. So real gaps in what learning will look like for young people. Equally, we're concerned about, how, we've spent a lot of time talking about UDL, inclusion with our students, planning for learning to meet the needs of all learners. And I guess the lack of flex in this makes us question about what that will look like. But we'll come back to that in a minute. So the core and overarching concerns from the health and PE community kind of stem around these things. And we note it's a draft, but our faith in it moving beyond this are really limited, and there's a lot of distrust nationally around how curriculum is being developed and whose voices are actually counting. And it feels really contradictory when I say that, given, we're talking to our students about being policy actors, we're endeavouring to be policy actors, but we just happen to have a minister who quite happily talks about some constructivist has been writing in this document and we need to get rid of it because that's not where we're going. So, our sense of agency within it feels limited. So some overarching concerns for us are the separation of subjects and who owns what knowledge and skills. So health education is now framed as bodies and mind, relationships, and at year 8 they get knowledge around sex ed. We haven't called it sex ed in New Zealand since the late 90s, but we're going back to sex ed. They don't get to do any of the, there's no practices associated with sex ed, it's just about knowing. But the relationship stuff in particular also used to sit within physical education, and that's gone. As I've indicated, there's a lack of scaffolding and or flexibility for teachers, and across the curriculum we don't see clear scaffolding between the year levels. In terms of physical education is solely now called movement skills, and it's not movement skills and motor concepts like we've embraced. As I've said, it's got nothing to do with relationships or healthy communities or environments or personal identity or teamwork or anything like that. So underpinning notions about learning in, through and about movement have completely been eroded. As I've already indicated, there's nothing in there about haora that's been threaded through everything in physical education, and we've lost any real evidence of a socio-critical, socio-cultural kind of perspective that we've always embraced. So it is a feeling of a regression back to multi-activity. I'm going to say very loosely frame around TGFU without any acknowledgement of any other models that we might draw on or focus on. We're seeing it very individualistic, where ecological kind of perspective has been adopted in the past. When we look through physical education, it's ableist. If you have any sort of movement impairment of any sort, there's nothing explicitly there to address you, and it's pretty much devoid of cultural context. There's the odd drop-in tokenistic reference to a Māori game or a Māori movement pattern such as haka, but that's about where it stops. And we are really concerned about the intention to provide lessons, units, and potentially textbooks. And there's already, we know Athletics New Zealand's already been in with Sport New Zealand talking about how they'll be able to deliver the athletics part of the package. So we do see it as the outsourcing potentially being on the rise, and we think the approach around textbooks, units, has the potential to really deprofessionalise us as a workforce, and what it means to actually be a teacher of physical education as we go forward. Sitting alongside that, and very briefly, we're seeing what they're calling system reform, we might call it deform. So there's two other big moves happened this in the last couple of weeks. The strengthening, they've called them the strengthening of initial teacher ed and workforce governance, and the removal of the requirement to give effect to tiriti or watangi. So we would see it, the first one of the real undermining of the workforce around teacher registration. And the ministry, for the first time ever, going to be the people approving ITE programs, as opposed to that being a decision that's made by the sector. A direct quote from the minister is, "We're placing teacher registration standards within the ministry focus function because they're of their critical role in driving quality in ITE. When registration standards are clear and rigorous, aligned with what we expect new graduates to do, universities and ITE providers must design their programs to ensure graduates meet those expectations. The registration standards are an essential lever for strengthening the quality and consistency of initial teacher education programs." In line with that, we've seen the explosion and approval of private providers of initial teacher education being signed off by the government, and one of those private providers is now the head of the Teaching Council. So we're really seeing basically nearly a dictatorship around what initial teacher education will and won't be able to do, aligned with curriculum control really sitting at the seat of the minister, and not as a discussion led by educators and informed by educators and experts in the field. We're seeing a rollback on every bit of progress we might have made in relation to Māori and Pacific learners in particular, and the deepening inequalities that exist there. And our Education Review Office, the minister talks about them becoming faster and stronger, but most people across the education sector are talking about them becoming more punitive too in schools, a bit like it's happened in place in the UK, just not meeting the standards and being governed and controlled more by the ministry. So we are seeing it as a deprofessionalisation of our workforce. So briefly, I talked about curriculum as inclusion. I guess we're seeing now that neoliberalism, if we want to use that term in the broader sense, is actually now where our curriculum is, where it's ableist. There's a push for everyone to be the same, and that no one should get special treatment because that's not equity, that's not equal, and everyone deserves equal treatment. Colourblindness, individual responsibility, all the things that we've kind of resisted along the way. So we speak about, I'll just leave it there. So I feel like we are regressing, and I guess Ireland now is a place of hope in terms of what health and physical education, or SPHE, could look like. All of this has led us to think about what does that mean for initial teacher ed in our country and in our institution. I want to start. So recently someone asked me, what will you do in your HPE papers if this all goes through, and how will you respond to the changing landscape? And to be honest, my gut reaction, my first thought is I'm just going to double down. I'm going to add more of a layer of critique so that all our students have that really broad understanding of the nature and purpose of PE. I know that's not a constructive response, and I don't have constructive responses at this point because I think we're all still, well, I think we just hope the government will not get through next year and we'll actually get to go back to something we believe in, but that's probably delusional. So it has really challenged us to think about what would an IT program look like, and what will it look like, particularly if the government actually gets to mandate what we do and don't do. And so, you know, it's a cue to remind us that we are policy actors and we need to model that within for our students. And how we do that in our own institutions is going to be crucial. And at the same time, my colleagues in social sciences and languages and technology and English and maths, we're all fighting those same battles. So there is a collective voice around the denigration of curriculum and what it means and what it might mean for us as a profession. I think we're all holding on to the feeling that we are feeling professionally compromised because we haven't felt trusted or to have a voice in this, and we don't know who's written it like we have in previous years in terms of curriculum. But equally not falling in the trap of being complicit in deprofessionalising the workforce. And so lots of people have resisted pushes from the government to come and write these new resources to develop the texts that will go out to schools that every year 9 class will deliver and follow for next year. So, you know, holding those two tensions together for us has been part of it. Given I mainly focus on primary initial teacher ed, and this is not a new thought, but I have come to think that the subject and disciplinary boundaries that we put in place in our initial teacher education programs and we reinforce often in our practices of professional learning in schools actually do very little to support the generalist teacher. And that is because their work is complex. They're being asked to do much more around integration of teaching. We work in an environment where they are going to be required to spend 3 hours a day on reading, writing and maths, which leaves very little time for any other learning areas. And so what do we need our generalist teachers to know and understand about health and PE that might allow them to bring health and PE to life in their classroom? And if I go back to I'm going to call it the honeycomb, I don't know why we've come about that. And the discussions we've had so far, we would still hold to those things with our primary school teachers. And we're really thinking about what does it mean when we talk about curriculum mapping and where things sit with the curriculum going forward. Because right now I think we feel really uncomfortable with pushing a curriculum that is very grey in terms of our thinking. I come back to the sense of, do I teach them to do roles or I teach them about their roles? So it is that question of what content matters and what do we really need to teach to our students are questions we're going to have to re-grapple with, especially if we want to hold on to what we think matters most for akonga, for our students, for the students they teach and what that will mean for ITE. I don't have answers to those yet, and maybe by this time next year I'll be in a better place to think about how my views on initial teacher ed sit and what it means in this policy context. I do want to wish those of you who are responsible for thinking about ITE as a new curriculum comes into force in Ireland to enjoy that challenge and the excitement of what those curriculum documents actually really offer. And I have to admit, I'm really envious of that right now. So that's enough from me today. I think it's Deborah's birthday, if I'm correct. So can we pass on birthday wishes to her? And I just thought it was worthwhile reflecting on a few images of the joyous times in Ireland over the years. And I wish I was there right now. So thank you very much for that. I know I've probably gone too long, but if there's any partai, any questions, yeah, now it's now heading towards midnight, so I'm all good for answering questions about now.
Delete.
Okay, stopped. Questions. Stopped the recording.